The galaxy had not seen war for more than a century. The great fleets were silent, drifting only for patrols, and children grew up learning that conflict was only a story from the past. Yet peace had a fragile skin, and when it tore with fear. It started with a faint sound that cut through the silence of space. A strange transmission carrying no code, no warning, no treaty, only one thing, a name, a human name, repeated in a voice not of this world. It was spoken by the deadliest species the galaxy had ever known, the species no one dared to name aloud, and in that moment, the calm of 100 worlds shattered, because if they spoke a name, it meant war. On distant stations, workers froze as the signal replayed, governments scrambled to decode it. But there was nothing to decode, the meaning was clear, the most feared predators in the universe had spoken, and they had chosen a target, not a planet, not a fleet, not a government, but one human, one person who lived quietly somewhere under the stars. The chilling details spread across command rooms and council chambers. Leaders whispered and argued. Some said it was a mistake. Others said it was a threat, but all knew the same truth. The deadliest species never wasted words. If they had spoken, blood would follow. On Earth, the sun rose without alarm, ordinary people went to work, children laughed in schools, and families planned their days, unaware that across the galaxy, their home was being watched. Deep in orbit, cloaked ships hovered, scanning, waiting. Every fleet commander who saw the signal remembered the stories, the ancient wars, the tales of planets burned to ash. Those who fought this species did not survive. Whole civilizations had fallen before, and now the horror returned. A council of allied races gathered in a hidden chamber. Their voices trembled, some urged to surrender, others to fight. But no one could agree why a single name was spoken, why one human carried such weight. What secret could make the deadliest species break centuries of silence? One elder, her scales old and brittle, whispered that perhaps the name was not a target, but a key, maybe that human carried something more dangerous than fleets or weapons. But no one dared speak further. Fear gripped every word. Military stations lit up with alerts, fleets prepared in silence, admirals looked at the sky with dread, knowing that if war began, nothing could stop it. The deadliest species did not come with peace. They came with fire, yet the mystery of the name haunted every mind. Who was this person? Why them? And what fate had already tied them to a storm greater than any army? The universe held its breath, and in the quiet, the transmission played again. The same voice, the same name, louder, like thunder through the void. On a small colony near the edge of known space, a young communications officer replayed the signal for the 100th time. Her hands shaking, her captain asked if she was sure it was real. She nodded, and the entire crew fell into silence. Outside their window, the stars burned cold. But it felt as if eyes were watching, eyes older than empires, hunters who had waited patiently for this moment, and now they had spoken, the prey was chosen. Rumors spread faster than light, whispers in taverns, fear in markets, ships refusing to travel near the edges. Everyone spoke of the name though none dared say it aloud. It was as if the sound itself carried danger, and still no one knew the person behind it. Somewhere on Earth, a man or woman lived unaware, their ordinary life about to be shattered, because beyond the sky, armies moved, shadows gathered, and the galaxy, once at peace, braced for war. The leaders of Earth finally received the message, and when they heard the voice speak the name of one of their own, silence fell in the war room. Generals looked at each other, pale, knowing what it meant. They remembered the archives, the warnings, and they understood. The deadliest species in the universe did not bluff. They had chosen, and by choosing, they had declared war. The whisper in the stars was not a mistake, it was a death sentence. And the clock had already started ticking. The signal kept playing in hidden corners of the galaxy, and each time it carried the same echo, a single human name. The more it repeated, the more fear spread, and soon that fear turned into panic. Governments began moving fleets out of storage. Soldiers who thought their careers would end in peace were suddenly handed weapons, and old admirals who had retired were called back to duty. Across the stars the same question burned. Why had the deadliest species in the universe spoken the name of one human? Why not a fleet or a planet? What power could one person have to draw such attention? And why now after so many years of silence? On Earth, life still carried on as normal. The streets were busy, children played, markets buzzed with noise. But high above the planet in orbit, secret councils were meeting. Leaders gathered around glowing tables where the transmission played again and again, their faces pale with dread. One general slammed his fist down and said it must be intimidation, a way to weaken morale, but another spoke quietly and reminded them of the history. The last time this species had spoken, entire civilizations were wiped away. They did not waste words, they did not play games, they hunted, they destroyed, and they always finished what they started. That silence in the room was heavier than stone, because deep down everyone knew, this was not empty noise, this was a death call. The human whose name was spoken still lived quietly, unaware that the galaxy had turned its eyes upon them. Their days were filled with routine, work, family, laughter, and dreams of nothing more than an ordinary life. But shadows were already forming around them. Ships cloaked in black hovered far out of sight, scanning Earth, watching every move, waiting for the command to strike. Agents on distant colonies began asking questions, tracing family lines, searching old records, as if the name itself held a puzzle, and those who dug too deep vanished without a trace, leaving only silence behind. Far across the stars, a secret meeting was held by the allied races. Each one had memories, or at least the scars, of what happened when the deadliest species moved. They remembered burning skies, oceans turning to steam, cities erased in minutes, and all of them had sworn never to fight them again. Yet now the name of a human had forced them into the center of a storm. One ambassador asked if perhaps it was better to surrender the human, to offer them up before war could spread, but the room turned cold, because no one trusted that surrender would save them. Everyone knew that once the predators chose, there was no mercy, no bargain, only blood. The fleets began to move in silence, long dark warships rising from their slumber, engines humming with power not used in decades, soldiers trained in panic, trying to remember drills they had thought they would never need, and everywhere the fear grew, markets emptied, families rushed to hide in shelters, entire colonies shut down travel, all because a name had been spoken, one name that had turned the galaxy into a cage of terror. The deadliest species did not send more words, they did not explain, they did not threaten, they only sent silence after the name, and that silence was worse than any warning, because it meant they were already coming, it meant fleets were already in motion, and no one knew from which shadow they would appear. The mystery deepened when small outposts at the edge of known space went dark. Ships sent to investigate never returned. The governments tried to hide it. But whispers spread, people knew. The hunters were already here. On Earth, the leaders debated what to do with the person whose name was called. Some argued to hide them, bury them so deep no signal could reach them. Others said to use them as bait, to draw out the enemy and strike back. But no one had the courage to ask the person themselves. Because how could they? How could anyone tell an ordinary human that their very name had started a war? That their life was now the reason fleets moved, planets panicked, and millions prepared to die? So for now the truth was hidden, but the shadow drew closer with each passing night. The human continued to dream small dreams, unaware that beyond the stars, armies whispered, machines awoke, and enemies sharpened their blades. Yet strange things began to happen around them. Power outages near their home, strange lights in the sky, neighbors who suddenly acted distant, as if they too were being watched. They felt the weight of unseen eyes, and though they could not explain it, a chill crept into their bones, the sense that something vast, ancient, and deadly was moving in their direction. In the hidden halls of the Allied Council, one elder finally spoke words that no one wanted to hear. He said the name was not a threat. It was a curse, and once it was spoken, fate itself could not be stopped. The predators had already marked their prey, and they would come no matter what, and when they came, they would not stop at one human. They would bring fire until the stars themselves trembled, and still no one knew why. No one knew what secret the name carried, but everyone feared it was something far greater than anyone could imagine. And so the galaxy, once wrapped in peace, now trembled on the edge of destruction. Soldiers prayed, leaders argued, families fled, and in the silence of space the hunters moved closer, unseen, unstoppable, and waiting for the right moment. The whisper in the stars had become a storm, and the human whose name it carried was about to learn that the universe's deadliest species had chosen them, and by choosing, had already declared war. The silence after the transmission was worse than the transmission itself, because now every commander, every admiral, every leader in the galaxy knew what that silence meant. The hunters had already begun to move, and soon their presence would not be whispers or shadows, it would be fire. The first sign came at the very edges of known space, where a colony of miners worked quietly on a barren moon. They never expected to see warships, but one night the stars shifted, and black shapes filled the sky, vast vessels that blotted out the moons above them. There was no warning, no demands, only beams of burning light that carved through stone and metal alike. Within hours the colony was gone, erased so completely that even signals from distress beacons were cut off. It was the first strike, and it carried the same message as the transmission: the war had begun. When word of the destroyed colony reached the councils, panic erupted. The images were short, blurry, and terrifying: fragments of fire, flashes of screams, the sound of air rushing from broken domes. Then nothing. Governments tried to keep the news quiet. But fear has a way of spreading faster than truth, and soon every planet knew. The deadliest species had returned, they had chosen their prey, and they were no longer waiting in shadows. The hunt had begun. Admirals ordered fleets into formation, but many of them knew it was only a show. No one had ever won against these hunters. Not once, not in all of history. On Earth, life still appeared calm. Though the military had begun quiet drills, ships hidden deep in orbit lit their engines for the first time in decades. Soldiers were deployed under the excuse of training exercises, and satellites scanned the skies endlessly, all trying to hide the truth from ordinary people. Yet small signs of war leaked into daily life. Shelves of supplies began to empty, neighbors whispered in fear. Families started asking questions about bunkers they had never thought they would need. The person whose name had been spoken began to notice the changes too. Though no one explained anything to them, they felt the world shifting, as though invisible walls were closing in, and that uneasy feeling grew with each passing day. The first direct clash came when a patrol fleet of mixed races ventured near the edge of the destroyed colony, hoping to gather evidence or at least warn other worlds. What they found instead was a nightmare. Black ships waiting like predators in the void. The hunters did not hide, they opened fire at once. And the patrol fleet was torn apart in minutes. Their weapons barely scratched the enemy hulls. Their shields shattered as though made of glass. Only a few survivors managed to escape and tell the tale, their faces pale, their voices shaking as they described ships that seemed alive, vessels that moved with the speed and precision of beasts, not machines, and they all repeated the same haunting detail. The enemy broadcast the name again as they attacked, repeating it like a vow. In the councils of the Allied worlds, debates turned to shouting. Should they reveal the truth to the human whose name had been spoken? Should they protect them? Or should they sacrifice them in hopes the war might end? One faction argued that giving up one life could save billions. But others shouted that surrender would not stop the hunters. It never had in the past. The predators did not forgive. They did not bargain. Once they chose a name, they never stopped until it was erased. But still, the arguments continued, and as they argued, more colonies fell, each one erased with the same terrifying silence. The human at the center of it all began to feel the shadow pressing closer. Strange figures watched from across the street. Unmarked cars idled near their home, and at night they dreamed of voices calling their name. A cold echo that matched the transmission they had never heard. Though no one explained, they sensed that something vast and terrible was closing in, and their once simple life now felt like the calm before a storm they could not escape. Questions formed in their mind. Questions no one dared answer. Why did they feel as though the universe itself was staring at them? And why did they wake each morning with the certainty that their name carried weight far beyond their understanding? The first strike on Earth's allies forced leaders to make a decision. Fleets could no longer sit idle. Soldiers could no longer just train. War had already arrived, and it was spreading faster than they could contain. So they ordered massive evacuations of vulnerable colonies. But it was already too late for many. Whole populations vanished into the dark. Their worlds left burning behind them. Refugees filled space stations, their faces haunted, their voices trembling with stories of black ships moving like shadows and voices speaking names in the dark. Always the same name. The name of one human who still lived quietly on Earth, unaware that their life was the reason for so much death. In hidden rooms deep under the capital, Earth's leaders finally gathered with the highest generals and scientists. They admitted the truth to one another. The name was not a random choice. Records from old wars hinted at something buried, an ancient experiment. A secret pact that tied humanity to the hunters in ways no one fully understood. And though the records were broken and burned, one thing was clear. The person whose name had been spoken was connected to it. Their bloodline carried Something that could not be ignored, and perhaps that was why the hunters had returned. Perhaps that was why they had chosen this moment to speak. But none of them had the courage to speak that truth aloud to the human, not yet. As the war spread, the galaxy grew darker, stars that had once been safe turned hostile, trade routes collapsed, and everywhere fleets tried to stand against the hunters. But they were always outmatched. Every battle ended the same way: fire and silence, wreckage drifting in the void, and the whisper of that single name echoing through the comms like a curse. The ordinary human's life was shrinking, walls of secrecy and fear wrapped tighter around them, until they could feel it in every breath. Though they still did not know why, deep down they understood, something terrible was coming for them, and when it came, it would not only take their life, it would decide the fate of the galaxy itself. The galaxy had already begun to bleed when the first pieces of truth slipped through the cracks of history. Governments tried to bury it, councils tried to deny it, but records that had been sealed for centuries surfaced in fragments, bits of burned data cores, shredded files hidden in forgotten vaults, and whispers from scholars who had studied forbidden wars. The pieces did not make sense at first, scattered and broken. But when fitted together they began to form a picture that chilled even the bravest commanders. The human whose name had been spoken by the hunters was not chosen at random. They were tied to something old, something buried so deep even Earth itself had almost forgotten. In secret rooms, Earth scientists replayed old recordings pulled from forgotten archives, ancient wars where the same hunters had swept across stars, burning civilizations into ash. In one of those fragments was a mention of an experiment, a desperate plan created in the heart of humanity's darkest war. A project that was meant to give humanity a chance to survive the predators. Though it was never finished, or so history claimed. The details were vague, filled with codes and broken language. But one truth stood out: the project was tied to bloodlines. It was not just a weapon or a ship. It was something living, something that could be passed down, hidden in families, waiting silently for generations, and the hunters had never forgotten. While leaders pieced together fragments, the human whose name had been spoken still walked among crowds unaware. Though every step of their life was now being watched, soldiers shadowed them, cameras tracked them, and hidden agents lingered near their home. They felt the weight of eyes but did not know why. Each night they dreamed more vividly, dreams of burning skies and black ships, of voices that whispered their name again and again. The same voice that had echoed through the stars. They woke with sweat on their skin, their heart racing, not understanding that the dreams were more than imagination. They were echoes of something older, something reaching through their blood. In the Allied Council, debates turned bitter. Some argued that the human must be handed over, sacrificed to end the war. But others shouted that it would not end. History had proved that once the hunters moved, they never stopped, not until the prey was completely erased. If the human was surrendered, the predators would not stop at one life. They would burn Earth. They would erase every trace, yet the fear grew stronger. And in corners of the council secret voices began to plan. Some whispered of betrayal, of quietly sending the human to the hunters before Earth itself even knew, desperate to save their own worlds at any cost. Meanwhile, colonies fell one after another, each time the hunters broadcast the name before striking, as if they were reminding the galaxy that everything was tied to that single human. Survivors described black ships moving like shadows, impossible to target, their weapons slicing through fleets like paper, and always the same voice spoke through comms before the final blow. Repeating the name as if it was both curse and vow, the pattern was undeniable. The hunters were not after planets. They were not after resources. They were after the person, the ordinary human on Earth who still had no idea their very existence had started a war. At last, one scientist uncovered a fragment of a diary written centuries ago. It spoke of a pact, an agreement between desperate human leaders and forces they barely understood. They had tried to create a safeguard, something tied to human blood that could resist the predators. But the diary ended in broken words, only suggesting that the experiment had failed. Yet if it had truly failed, why had the predators spoken the name now? Why had they waited centuries? The answer was terrifying. The experiment had not failed completely. Something had survived, and it lived inside the blood of the one whose name was now hunted. The human began to notice strange changes in their own life, at first small things, moments of strength when they should have been weak, moments of clarity when they should have been afraid. Their body healed from small wounds faster than it should, and they started to feel sensations they could not explain, hearing faint whispers when no one was around, Sensing danger before it appeared, it frightened them. Though they told no one, deep inside they knew something was wrong. Something was waking inside them, something that should never have been hidden. The leaders of Earth finally made a decision. They could no longer keep the truth hidden, not from themselves, not from the one whose name had been called. They summoned the human to a deep underground chamber, guarded by soldiers and filled with old machines, and for the first time the truth was spoken aloud. Their name was not chosen at random. It was chosen because their blood carried something from an ancient past, something humanity had buried but never destroyed, something that the deadliest species in the galaxy feared enough to burn worlds to reach. The humans sat in silence as the words washed over them, disbelief, anger, fear, all mixed together. How could an ordinary life hide such a secret? How could something in their blood draw such death across the stars? But as the explanation continued, their mind was pulled back to the strange dreams, the moments of strength, the whispers in the dark, and suddenly it all made sense. They were not ordinary. They had never been. They were the key to something greater. Though what that meant they did not yet know. The predators drew closer with every hour, fleets of black ships gathering in the shadows of space, burning worlds as warnings, and still the name was spoken, repeated as if to remind the galaxy that this was not just a war of weapons. It was a war of blood and secrets. The truth of the past had begun to surface, but the full meaning remained hidden, and as the hunters closed in, the humans stood at the center of a storm that would decide the fate of not only Earth, but the galaxy itself. The whisper in the stars had become fire, and the secret buried in their blood was about to awaken. The hunters kept burning their way through the outer colonies, but commanders watching the battles began to notice something strange. The predators fought with their usual fury. Their ships carved through defenses with merciless ease, yet their actions seemed cautious, not wild, not reckless, almost as though they were afraid of something. The fleets of the deadliest species never showed hesitation in past wars. They were known to charge into fire, to overwhelm by sheer terror. But now they struck quickly and withdrew, always circling, always searching, always broadcasting the same human name. The pattern was clear. They were not just attacking for conquest. They were hunting with purpose, and purpose meant fear. In the war councils, that detail turned into a storm of debate. Some argued that the hunters feared the human whose name they had spoken, that something inside that bloodline was powerful enough to terrify them. Others said it was madness to believe that one person could frighten the most ruthless species in the galaxy. But the evidence kept growing, fragments of intercepted signals, coded messages among the hunters themselves, translated only in pieces, but all circling the same truth. The predators did not just want to kill, they wanted to erase completely, as if what they hunted was not a threat to humans alone, but a threat to their very survival. On Earth, the human whose name echoed in the stars sat in guarded silence, locked away in deep bunkers while generals and scientists studied them like a riddle. Machines scanned their blood, searching for what the predators feared. The human felt trapped, every hour filled with questions and no answers. Their dreams grew darker, visions of black skies, burning worlds, and shadows that whispered in voices not human. Each night the whispers grew sharper, telling them they were not safe, telling them that the predators feared not who they were, but what they carried, deep inside, hidden in their veins. They woke trembling, yet stronger than before, as if each dream pulled something awake. The first proof came during an ambush. A small human fleet was cornered by the predators. The hunters moved in, their black ships ready to cut them down. But then something strange happened. The human at the center of it all cried out in their sleep, their body writhing with fever, and at the same moment, the predator ships faltered, their movements grew unsteady, their weapons hesitated, and for the first time in centuries, their fleet pulled back, leaving survivors stunned. The link was undeniable. The hunters had sensed something in that moment, something they feared enough to retreat, though the human themselves did not even understand what they had done. News of the retreat spread through the hidden channels of the allied worlds. It gave hope where there had been none. Perhaps the hunters were not invincible. Perhaps the human whose name had started this war could also end it. But fear came with hope, because if the predators truly feared what lay hidden in one human, then they would never stop until it was destroyed. They would burn every planet, kill every soul, if it meant ending that threat forever. The human began to feel the change more each day, strength in their body that was not natural, instincts sharper than before. They could sense danger before alarms sounded, hear whispers of thought that were not their own. Sometimes they saw flashes of places they had never been, battlefields from centuries ago, faces long dead, as though their blood carried memories not their own. It frightened them deeply, but it also gave them clarity. The predators were not just enemies. They were afraid. Afraid of what humanity could become if this secret was ever fully awakened. Among the predators, fragments of intercepted speech finally revealed a chilling truth. They spoke of humanity not as prey, but as rivals, as something that had once nearly destroyed them in forgotten wars. They had hidden the truth from the galaxy, burying it in silence. But now it was rising again in the form of a single name, one human carrying the last spark of an ancient weapon that had nearly ended the hunters long ago. The weapon was not a machine, it was not a fleet, it was something living, something bound to human blood. And now it was awake again. The Allied Council argued in desperation. Some believed the human must be protected at all costs, a key to ending the war. Others feared them as much as the predators did, wondering what kind of weapon could be bound inside a person. Some whispered that perhaps the predators were right, that this secret was too dangerous for the galaxy itself. But those words were drowned by the sound of explosions, because while they argued, the hunters struck closer, this time destroying a defense station. Near Earth's borders, the war was no longer far away. It was at humanity's doorstep. The human finally demanded answers, their voice echoing in the bunker, their fists clenched with a strength that frightened the guards. They asked why their name had been called, why entire worlds burned because of them, why their dreams carried visions of war. The generals tried to explain carefully, telling them of the ancient project, the bloodline experiment, the fear that the predators carried, but no words could soften the truth. Their life was no longer their own. It was a weapon, a secret, and a curse, and the predators would never stop until it was gone. As the truth sank in, the human felt both anger and sorrow. They had never wanted to be anything more than ordinary, yet now the fate of billions pressed against their shoulders. But beneath the fear of fire began to rise. They realized that if the predators feared them, then perhaps they carried the power to strike back, to turn fear against the hunters for the first time in history. It was a dangerous hope, but it was the only hope left. And deep in their blood something stirred, answering. That fire, something older than the war itself, waiting to be unleashed. In the dark reaches of space, the hunters gathered again, fleets larger than anything the galaxy had seen in centuries, their voices repeating the same human name. But this time there was a crack in their words, not just hatred, not just hunger, but fear. They were no longer just predators hunting prey. They were enemies desperate to destroy what they could not control. And as their ships closed in, the humans stood on the edge of revelation, knowing that the war was no longer about survival. It was about fear itself, and for the first time in history, the deadliest species in the universe was afraid. The hunters no longer hid their intent. Their fleets swept closer with each passing day, their black ships circling Earth's borders like predators that had cornered prey. But what chilled every leader, every soldier, and every civilian who heard their broadcasts was not just the destruction they left behind. It was the way their voices filled the comms before every strike. The same human name repeated again and again, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in roars that shook ships to their core. Your name must end, they said in countless tongues, and those words carried across the stars like a death sentence. Now the war was no longer distant, no longer about colonies or borders. It had become personal, and all of it pointed to one human. Inside the underground bunker, the human whose name had become the center of the war could no longer escape the truth. They were not just a target. They were the reason for every burning world, the reason children fled into shelters, the reason entire fleets died screaming into the void. The generals tried to shield them with guards, but whispers reached their ears, soldiers speaking behind closed doors, some blaming them, some fearing them, others seeing them as a weapon that might turn the war. Betrayal festered in shadows, not from the predators, but from within humanity itself. For when fear grows, loyalty breaks, and already some factions in the Allied Council debated giving the human up to save themselves. The human felt the weight of this betrayal in quiet ways, conversations that ended when they entered the room, stares from soldiers that carried more suspicion than respect. Guards who once stood firm now shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they were protecting a savior or a curse. The loneliness pressed hard, and in the silence of the bunker, the dreams grew worse, visions of burning skies and black ships circling closer, voices chanting their name in unison, until they woke gasping in the dark. Their hands shaking, But inside those same dreams a spark grew, glimpses of strength, moments where they stood unafraid, facing the hunters not as prey, but as something more. The Allied Council fractured further with each battle lost. Some worlds declared they would not sacrifice their fleets for Earth. Others whispered they would rather betray humanity than fall with them. And in secret, envoys even sent messages toward the predators, hoping to buy mercy with betrayal. But those envoys never returned, their ships vanishing into silence, and everyone knew deep down what had happened. The hunters did not bargain. They erased, and any who sought to betray humanity only hastened their own death. Yet still, fear kept growing, feeding rumors and doubt, and the human became the center of that fear. On Earth, the skies grew tense as evacuation drills began in every city. Governments told the people it was only practice, but panic spread, supplies vanished from shelves, families fled inland, and whispers filled the streets that the hunters were coming for one person, and that person was still alive somewhere among them. Many cursed that life, others prayed for it. But all of them felt the weight of the war pressing down, and above it all, the hunters' broadcasts kept coming. Your name must end, repeated with a fury that sent chills through even the strongest hearts. In the bunker, the human demanded to be told everything, demanded to know what it was inside them that made the hunters afraid. The scientists revealed what little they understood, fragments of the ancient experiment. A project to bind living power into human bloodlines, something born in the desperate wars of the past. A weapon not of steel or fire, but of life itself, unfinished, untested, and yet alive inside them. The human listened in silence, their heart torn between fear and anger. Because they had never asked for this, never wanted to carry the burden of a war that spanned galaxies. Yet now they could no longer deny it. They felt it stirring inside, each day stronger, each night louder. The predators drew closer still, their fleets now striking outposts near Earth's moons, defenses shattered like paper, and survivors reported the same horror. The predators did not shout victory. They only repeated the human's name. A chant of fury and fear that echoed through the wreckage. Your name must end. It was no longer just a hunt. It was an obsession, and that obsession wrapped tighter around the human until even their guards looked at them with unease, as if wondering if the end of their name might save the rest. And then came the betrayal, quiet but sharp. A faction of the allied races, desperate and broken by fear, launched a secret mission. They sought to seize the human, to deliver them to the predators in exchange for peace. They struck in the dead of night, breaching the bunker with stealth units and assassins. Guards fell in silence, alarms blared too late, and for the first time the human found themselves face to face with those who would hand them over to certain death. Yet in that moment of terror, something inside awoke fully. Power surged in their veins, a strength that was not theirs alone. Whispers filled their mind, not of fear but of fire, and with a single cry they threw the attackers back, their bodies crashing against walls as though struck by invisible force. The betrayal had failed, but the truth could no longer be hidden. The weapon inside was real. The aftermath was chaos. Soldiers whispered of what they had seen. Generals feared the power as much as they hoped for it, and the Allied Council split even further. Some now demanded the human be trained, turned into the weapon they were meant to be, while others screamed that such power could destroy not only the predators but the galaxy itself. Meanwhile, the hunters moved ever closer, their fleets gathering for what everyone knew would be the final strike. Their broadcasts louder now, drowning comms with their chant, "Your name must end," until even children cried at the sound. The humans stood alone in the bunker, their heart heavy with sorrow for the lives lost, for the betrayal from those meant to protect them. But inside that sorrow a fire grew, the realization that they could no longer hide, no longer pretend to be ordinary. The predators feared them, the allies doubted them, and the galaxy's fate now balanced on their choice. For if their name must end, it would not end as prey. It would end as the spark that turned fear back on the hunters themselves. The war was no longer just at the edge of space, it was here, and they were ready to face it. The galaxy trembled as the predators gathered their full strength, black fleets moving like a tide across the stars, blotting out constellations, their arrival marked not by warnings or demands but by the endless broadcast of one phrase, "Your name must end." The words spread through every channel, every signal, even hijacking civilian networks so that children on distant colonies woke to the sound of it echoing through their homes. Never before had the hunters focused so much fury on a single life, and never before had so many feared that one life could decide the fate of billions. Earth braced for the inevitable. For the hunters were no longer striking colonies at the edge. They were coming directly for humanity's heart. The Allied Council, already broken by fear and betrayal, finally made a choice. Fleets were to be gathered for one last stand, not at the edge of space, not in distant defense lines, but around Earth itself. If the Predators wanted the human, they would have to tear through every fleet the galaxy could muster. Admirals who once hesitated now poured their forces into the defense, some out of loyalty, others out of desperation, knowing that if Earth fell, there would be nothing left to save. The void near Earth filled with ships of countless races, their engines glowing like stars, their hulls reflecting grim determination. It was a wall of steel and fire built not for victory but for survival. In the underground bunker, the human at the center of it all watched the movements unfold on glowing screens. They felt the weight of it pressing down. Billions preparing to fight, millions ready to die, all because of their name, all because of something hidden in their blood. They had never asked for this burden. Yet now they felt it more strongly than ever. The power stirring within them was no longer a whisper, it was a storm, pulsing in their veins. Their skins shivered with energy that frightened even the guards who watched them, and each night the dreams grew clearer. Visions of battles not yet fought, ships burning, stars trembling, and their own figure standing against the Predators with light pouring from their hands. The generals no longer treated them as a prisoner, but neither as an ally. They were something else, something uncertain, a weapon they could not control, and yet in every meeting their voices always returned to the same question. Would the human choose to fight? Would they step forward when the Predators arrived? Because everyone knew that fleets and armies alone could not win this war. The Predators feared something in the human, and perhaps only that fear could break them. The human listened to these words in silence, torn between anger and duty. But deep inside they already knew the answer. Hiding had cost too many lives, too many burning worlds. If their name was to decide the fate of the galaxy, then they would no longer run from it. The Predators struck first at the outer defenses, their ships moving with terrifying precision, cutting through Allied fleets as if they were nothing. Explosions lit the void, fragments of broken warships scattered across the stars. Survivors screamed over comms as the Predators repeated the chant. Your name must end, each word spoken like thunder. Yet for the first time the Allied fleets did not retreat. They fought back with everything they had, waves of missiles, beams of plasma, even desperate ramming strikes. The void became a storm of fire, and though the Predators tore through them, they no longer did so without cost. Their ships took damage. Their formations broke under the sheer fury of those who had nothing left to lose. Inside the bunker, the human felt each battle as if it was happening inside their own chest. Every ship destroyed echoed like pain in their veins. Every victory sparkled like fire in their blood. They began to understand the connection more clearly. The experiment of centuries ago was not just about passing power. It was about binding human life to the flow of war itself. They were tied to the Predators, tied to the fleets, tied to the very struggle playing out in the stars. And the more they understood, the stronger the storm inside them grew, until the walls of the bunker themselves seemed to tremble under the weight of it. Finally the Predators broke through the outer lines, their vast fleets pushing closer, Earth visible now on their long-range scans, their voices louder, filling every channel. Your name must end. The words shook the very ground of Earth. People in cities heard it in their homes, felt it in their bones, and panic spread. Yet among the terror a strange resolve began to rise. Because if the Predators feared this one human so much, then perhaps that human could do what no fleet had done before. Perhaps they could turn fear back on the hunters. The human demanded to be taken to the front, no longer willing to hide. Their eyes burning with light that made even the bravest soldiers step back. Generals argued, some screaming that it was too dangerous, others begging them to unleash whatever power they carried. In the end the choice was not theirs to make. The human walked past the guards, past the soldiers, their very presence breaking locks and barriers without touch. The storm inside them no longer willing to be caged. And for the first time they stood beneath the open sky, looking up at the stars where fleets clashed, and they felt the Predators watching, their name echoing louder than ever. The last stand had begun, Allied fleets forming a wall around Earth, Predator ships breaking against it like waves against stone. The void alive with fire, each explosion lighting the night sky of Earth so bright that children in cities below cried out. Knowing the war was no longer far above but directly over their heads, the humans stepped forward, standing among soldiers who watched in silence, and in that moment the storm inside them whispered clearly. This was never about hiding. It was about choosing, and now the choice was upon them, to stand and fight, or to fall and let the galaxy burn. The predators pushed closer, their weapons cutting through the last defense lines, Earth's fleets breaking apart, chaos filling comms, screams mixing with the endless chant. Your name must end, louder, sharper, until it drowned out everything. But for the first time, the human did not tremble at the words. They looked up into the sky, into the endless dark filled with hunters, and they whispered back a single vow. Then come and try. The storm inside them roared, and the last stand turned into the moment the galaxy had been waiting for, the moment when the name that had brought fear to every world would decide whether the hunters lived or fell. The last stand raged above Earth, the sky itself flashing with fire as fleets collided in a storm of destruction. Allied ships burned, predator vessels pressed forward, and through every comm channel the same chant repeated endlessly, your name must end, the words louder than the explosions, louder than the screams of dying soldiers, a thunder that seemed to shake the galaxy itself. Yet in the midst of all this chaos, the human whose name was hunted stood still on Earth's soil, their eyes fixed on the stars. The storm inside them no longer whispers but roaring waves, a power so strong that even the ground beneath their feet seemed to hum with it, and everyone who stood near them felt the air shiver, as though the world itself was waiting for their choice. The predators broke through the first ring of defense, their black ships tearing into the Allied fleets, hulls splitting, engines bursting, brave captains ramming their vessels into the enemy only to vanish in explosions that barely slowed the hunters. The second line collapsed minutes later, screams echoing as survivors fled toward Earth. Yet even in their fury the predators did not fire on random targets. Every strike, every maneuver, every broadcast carried the same focus. They wanted the human, and nothing else mattered. It was obsession written across the stars, an obsession born from fear. In the bunkers, generals shouted commands, desperate to hold the line. Some begged the human to hide, to stay underground. Others demanded that they step forward and unleash the power within them. But none could control what was happening. The human walked past their guards and out into the open. The storm inside them drawing them upward. They no longer felt fear. They no longer felt doubt. Only the certainty that this was the moment all of history had been moving toward. The hunters had spoken their name, but they would decide what that name meant. The predators reached Earth's orbit, their ships blotting out the stars, shadows swallowing the light, their chant filling every mind like a curse. Your name must end. Yet in that moment, the human raised their head. And for the first time they spoke back. Their voice carried not through comms but through something older, deeper, through the blood that tied them to the forgotten project of centuries ago. Their single word, their vow, spread like fire, and the storm inside them burst outward, light erupting from their body, a wave that surged into the sky and struck the predator fleets. The battlefield froze, predator ships shuddered as the wave of light passed through them, their weapons faltering, their movements breaking. For the first time in history they staggered back in fear, their chant faltered, their voices cracking, because what they had feared had finally awoken. The weapon bound to human blood was not a machine, not a fleet. It was a force that turned fear itself against the hunters. The human's presence filled the void. Their name no longer a curse but a beacon. Their bloodline no longer hidden but alive. And the predators, for the first time in centuries, screamed in terror. Allied fleets seized the moment, striking with renewed fury, pushing the hunters back, their broken formations collapsing under the counterattack. Explosions lit the dark as predator ships fell one by one. But the center of the battle was not weapons or fleets. It was the humans standing on Earth, light pouring from them, their storm reaching across the stars, burning into the predators' minds, showing them what they had tried so hard to bury. The memory of the ancient war where humanity had nearly ended them, the truth they had erased from history, and now that truth lived again in one person, one name, one soul that refused to fall. The predators tried to push forward again, their largest ships unleashing fire that shook the orbit. But every blast that neared Earth was torn apart by invisible force, shattered in midair by the storm surrounding the human. Fleets of black steel cracked as if crushed by unseen hands. Their screams of your name must end turning into wails of panic, their voices breaking with fear, and in those final moments they understood the truth. They had not hunted prey. They had awakened their own doom. On Earth, people poured into the streets, looking up at the sky as it burned with fire and light. They saw the predators falter. They saw the fleets push them back, and they saw one figure standing beneath it all, a human who had been ordinary, now shining with power older than the war itself. Children whispered their name not in fear but in awe, families cried in relief, and soldiers shouted with hope. For the first time the chant that had cursed them was broken, and the name that had haunted the galaxy became a symbol of survival. The predators, broken and terrified, began to retreat, their vast fleets scattering into the void, their voices fading into silence. The war was not won by weapons, not by numbers, but by fear turned back upon those who had spread it for centuries. The deadliest species in the universe, who had never known defeat, had been shattered by the very thing they had sought to destroy. The human whose name they had cursed now stood as the one they could not erase. When the last predator ship vanished into the dark, silence fell across the galaxy, fleets broken, worlds scarred, but hope alive. Leaders who once argued in fear now bowed their heads, understanding that the war had ended not because of councils or armies, but because of one person, one name, and the storm hidden in their blood. The humans stood in silence, their power finally settling, their body trembling with exhaustion, but their eyes clear. They had not asked for this burden, but they had carried it, and by carrying it, they had changed the fate of every world. The galaxy would never forget what had happened. The predators would return one day, that much was certain. But when they did, they would remember the name they had once tried to erase, a name that had turned fear into fire and rewritten the stars. The human looked to the sky, their heart heavy yet unbroken, and whispered softly, "My name will never end." The war was over, but the story of that name had only just begun.